this is Introduction to the Ketogenic Diet. I know it says 6 to 6:30, even though we're starting a little bit late. I would anticipate this going a little bit longer per usual of my webinars. My name is Ramon Sedano. I'm assuming a lot of you have watched a lot of my webinars before. I guess that's me just being kind of cocky. I hope you have, I guess. But if you have not, I work as the coordinator of fitness services and education at the Student Recreation Center at WSU. So I oversee the personal training, weight room, strength and conditioning, small group training, and well-being online departments. I also am an adjunct faculty instructor for the school. So I teach things like Kines 311, which is strength training, and Kines 305, which is essentially sports nutrition. So it's nutrition related to fitness and sport. Been in this field for a long time. I've given my introduction a bunch of times, and I feel a little pedantic, right? Showing off, learning. I don't need to go through all my certifications and that kind of stuff. So today we are going to be discussing the introduction to the ketogenic diet. So let's see if this will actually work. Okay, we're doing good. We're doing good. We had my technology standards aren't the best, and we're doing better this time. We figured some things out. So today what we'll be going through is we'll talk about the basics of macronutrients. If you just went through my Protein 101 webinar, this will be a quick review of those kinds of things. I just want you to completely understand what the macronutrients are and how it's important to understand those at the background to understand what's happening when we're going into a ketogenic state or what's happening with ketogenesis in the body and those kinds of things. I want to talk about a little bit of the keto history. I learned some stuff about where I'm sure a lot of us have an idea of where the ketogenic diet started from, but then I learned some other kind of cool things that were interesting. And we'll do a brief history of the ketogenic diet, where it came from. Basic terminology, which I understand when we get to things like gluconeogenesis and those kinds of things, it doesn't sound like basic terms, but we need to run through them to make sure that everyone understands what they are, because they will come up multiple times throughout this lecture. And I'll always remind what they are, but just to kind of foreshadow on them. Then we're going to go over the basics of bioenergetics. And do not fright at this. Bioenergetics is a deep, dark rabbit hole that is like it's my passion. When I get my PhD, I would like to get my PhD in bioenergetics, but we're going to talk about it hopefully on the most surface level area. I literally spent 2 hours developing that section, completely pulled it all out. I'm like, this is too confusing. Let's get it back to the basic levels. So we will talk about it in basic terms, or at least give you an understanding on the surface level of things. If any of you out there have a lot of experience in it, I apologize that we won't be breaking it down completely to every intermediate, factor within the Krebs cycle or those kinds of things. Then we'll talk about understanding ketosis, and that's essentially the bioenergetics of ketosis. We'll talk about how to get one into ketosis. So we'll do breakdowns of how much percent of carbohydrates to fats to protein do we need to be able to establish a ketogenic diet. We'll talk about it in two different ways. We'll do percentages, and then we'll also do grams per kilogram of body weight. And then we'll also talk about how it's super interdependent. And then we'll talk about some benefits of the ketogenic diet, not all of them, not all encompassing, just some cool ones that I thought about or that I think are interesting. And then we'll talk about some basic misconceptions that we see, and then we'll have questions at the end. So with that, we'll just keep on rolling through. So first off, we're talking about macronutrients. Our macronutrients are protein, carbohydrates, and fats. They are things that we need in large amounts of, and they provide the body with calories. So macro being we need in big amounts, and nutrients being they provide the body with something. And these macronutrients actually provide calories for the body to complete certain tasks. And typically what we see is our carbohydrates and our fats are utilized for energy production kinds of things, right? And our protein is to be able to establish anabolic factors within the body, maintaining tissues, helping synthesize hormones, and these kinds of things. Anabolic factors not really being broken down for their energy source to have us make the functions take place, while proteins and the amino acids that they are made up of can contribute to our energy productions. We typically don't want them to be a big energy production. That means that we're taking away from those tissues and needed systems in the body that those amino acids are needed for, and maybe possibly going into a starvation state. We would much rather focus on carbohydrates and fats to be able to do these things. However, when we do talk about things like the gluconeogenesis, and we talked about it in depth in our protein chapter of how proteins can be utilized for energy, but at the most part, we don't want it to be used for that on a small amount, no matter what they are used. But carbohydrates and fats are our dominant source of energy nutrients that we utilize for energy. And to kind of break that down a little bit more, carbohydrates, when you eat carbohydrates, they are broken down and digested in the body into a molecule called, well, they're broken down into various saccharides, disaccharides, polysaccharides, whatever makes them up. But at the end of the day, they're going to be broken down into glucose. And glucose is blood sugar, and this is what we're going to be able to utilize for energy within the body. Okay, and it's a preferred energy source of the body. So you have free form glucose that's floating around the blood, and then you have stored glucose, which is called glycogen. So glycogen is just a stored form of glucose. And then fats, when you eat them, they're going to be broken down into their fatty acids, and they're stored as these things called triglycerides, which is a glycerol molecule with 3 fatty acids. And we won't be focusing on glycerol today, but we'll be focusing a lot on fatty acids. As many of you know, that the ketogenic diet is going to be utilizing and manipulating fatty acids in a way to be able to utilize them as our dominant source of energy. So just remember at this point that carbohydrates, when eaten, are broken down into, at the very end of the day, they're broken into glucose, and when they are stored in the body, they're stored as glycogen. Fats are broken down into their fatty acids, and they're stored as triglycerides, and that's a glycerol molecule and 3 fatty acids. Also, just know proteins, I'm sure a lot of you know, and I would definitely recommend go check out our Protein 101. It was probably more of a 201 kind of webinar, but we'll talk about what really those are and the difference in amino acids. When we eat our proteins, they break down their individual amino acids that are utilized for a myriad of things. Myriad, I always say that word wrong, I don't know. All right, so this is just to kind of give us a foreshadow of what the ketogenic diet is, okay? This is not where we're going to go into the biochemistry and that kind of stuff. Essentially, what the ketogenic diet is it's a metabolic state in which your body uses fat and ketones rather than glucose or sugar, right, as its main fuel source. And we're able to do this by manipulating the body in a way where we're depriving the body of carbohydrates coming in, so there is no available glucose. We only have enough glucose and glycogen stored in the body and in the liver to be able to really start us sustain us for a day or so, okay? And at that point, there are certain functions or operations, systems, functions in the body that are specifically fueled by glucose, and glucose is the preferred energy system for these things. And the big one is our brain. So the brain consumes energy at 10 times the rate of the rest of the body per gram of tissue. It is a very greedy area. And it was thought for a long time that glucose is the only thing that can actually feed the brain. It's actually the only thing that can be utilized as an energy source. However, ketones can actually be that energy source for the brain. So fatty acids themselves cannot cross the blood-brain barrier, but after they go through ketogenesis and go into the state in the liver to where they're turned into the individual ketones, those ketones actually can cross the blood-brain barrier and act as fuel for the brain. And then essentially what we're doing is we're shifting the body's really at rest and at low intensity rates of exercise and those kinds of things. Fat really is the dominant source of our energy supply, right? But there is a large amount coming from carbohydrate and glucose. What we are doing in this ketogenic state and during the ketogenic diet is we are shifting the proportion of the utilization of fat even greater than it was at normal states, because we're completely depriving the body, not completely, but almost depriving the body of exogenous forms of glucose and carbohydrates, right? And again, the body can generate glucose from other sources through a process of developing, again, we'll talk about gluconeogenesis here in a little bit, but it's not to the extent to where it would support those functions as necessary. So the body was smart, right? Like we had to develop a system when we were hunter-gatherers or when we were wandering the Sahara to be able to support our functions, especially our greedy brain, when we didn't know when the next meal was going to come. We were really a feast-famine kind of individual, right? So the body was smart and it stores fat on it. And that's why our body still to this day is able to store fat on it, because when we run out of this supplied form or this preferred form of glucose, we can convert back to a different energy system within the body to be able to develop these ketones to sustain the functions of the brain, other functions of the body, and functions of muscle and other systems that are being utilized to create energy. And remember, we only have so much glucose stored and glycogen stored at one time to be able to support us. So that's when we will revert back to being able to utilize those ketones as our energy system. And I thought this was an easy little kind of picture to be able to kind of understand that. So that's just a brief understanding of what the ketogenic diet is. Essentially, it's a high-fat diet, very minimal carbohydrates, if any carbohydrates, and moderate protein. And we'll talk about why it's moderate protein, why we don't go to super high levels of protein on a ketogenic diet, because it would create an insulin response and kick us out of ketosis. You need a lot of protein, though. But first, I kind of want to talk about the history of the ketogenic diet and where it came from. And I'm sure a lot of you know that the ketogenic diet was initially utilized for epilepsy, or individuals who are epileptic, because it actually has an anti-seizing effect with it. However, before that, what happened? There was this guy named Bernard McFadden, who, as you can see in this Physical Culture magazine, he changed his name to Bernard McFadden because, according to him, this is literally a quote. It sounds more like a lion roar. He was like one of the first meatheads that we really had out there, right? He's your typical kind of came from nothing to developed into something kind of story. And he essentially started the first men's health magazine. It was called Physical Culture, right? And he would be an individual that would go around and very much prophesize or preach about the benefits of, you know, healthy foods, exercise, making sure to get your vegetables in, all these kind of stuff, as a kind of like the very first individual for preventative health care. And he would very much criticize the pharmaceutical companies and the types of medicines that were being utilized for all kinds of different ailments, diseases, and those kinds of things. And he ended up creating this McFadden Sanatorium, or the Physical Culture Sanitarium, in Michigan. It was actually across the street from the Battle Creek Sanitarium, which is where Kellogg's cereal was developed, right? I read this really interesting article on this individual. We can post the article. If you're interested in the history of ketogenic diet, it's a pretty fascinating article. Anyways, he opened up this place, and essentially it was like, there's rings and dumbbells and Turkish baths and saunas and all kinds of stuff that you would see, like essentially a rec center, right? And he would bring all kinds of individuals who were in, and he would actually treat them. He was considered a doctor, and he would treat them for different sicknesses. And some of the individuals that came there were epileptic individuals, or individuals suffering from epilepsy. And one thing that he definitely preached consistently was fasting, right? So going for long periods of time without eating food. And what he would do is he would put these epileptic patients on a fasting regimen, and what they would see is that they would have a drastic decrease in their seizures, right? Something up to it was like 80 to 85%, right? And this was seen time and time again, and all these people were coming there. And of course, the typical doctors were calling him a quack, this kind of stuff. They weren't really taking his data seriously. And then if you and understand that back in the day, there was two medications that were really utilized before there was crazy stuff happening that is crazy. If you just think about old school medicine of how they developed certain things, like it was demons in people's heads and, you know, that kind of stuff, right? But when they got a little bit more around to the standpoints of pharmaceuticals, they discovered that potassium bromide and another sedative, I think it was called luminol, were able to benefit individuals with epilepsy and be able to reduce the amount of seizures taking place. And the downfall to these medications was they were extreme sedatives. So you get the very zombie-like kind of individual, very lethargic, and you know, just not essentially what they were going for. But you may reduce the seizures, but you're turning someone into very, very kind of down, out, very sedative. And they thought at the time that the sedative effects of these medications is actually what was benefiting the seizures. So what we saw was, you know, Bernard McFadden and some other individuals at the sanitarium were being able to relieve these epileptic seizures in these individuals through fasting regimens. And he didn't realize at this point, because understand when you're in a fasted state, you go into a ketogenic state, right? He did not understand that he was putting these individuals into ketosis. At the time, he thought that he was that the issue was in the intestines, and that he was depriving the body of certain toxins that were causing these seizures. That was his thought process. So flash forward to, I think it was like 1916, 19, somewhere closer to the 20s, an actual doctor, a series of doctors sent patients to this Physical Culture Sanitarium, to where they went through Bernard McFadden's treatment, his fasting treatments, and they saw time and time again benefits taking place with the individuals that they sent there. They copied the protocols and put them into play within their own medical institutions, and presented at one of the AMA conferences in the late 1900s. Not late 1900, but like 1917, 1918. And it was something like, out of like 60 patients, 87% were completely seizure-free, right? And so now you're getting this crazy kind of medicine from this crazy meathead dude coming at an actual medical conference and getting all these people, like just hitting them in the face that it's working, right? So then they start establishing, but fasting protocols obviously are not sustainable, right? You can't fast somebody forever. And of course, even though after the fast would end, the seizures would come back, sometimes at a lower rate, but sometimes they would come back at the same rate. So other individuals throughout the country were thinking about these ideas at the same time. There was other doctors that were looking at diabetes at the time. So how can we not have these diabetic comas take place? I understand that type 1 diabetes was the main issue at the time. Then type 2 diabetes wasn't a huge ordeal. And if you understand what type 1 diabetes is, it is a autoimmune disease to where the pancreas is essentially attacked and can no longer produce insulin anymore. And insulin essentially is this hormone that shuttles stuff in your body from place to place. There's a lot more with insulin than just that, but essentially insulin is going to be what shuttles your glucose into the target tissues, into the muscle tissues to be utilized. So if your insulin isn't being produced, you're going to have high levels of blood glucose, and then when you have extremely high levels of blood glucose, there can be diabetic coma and those kinds of things. So then they came across this thing of fasting. They decided to try a high-fat diet, right? And so they removed carbohydrates completely from these individuals with type 1 diabetes, put them on essentially a ketogenic diet. That's when it was termed, right? And they saw benefits for these individuals because they were no longer taking these exogenous stores of blood sugar in from carbohydrates, thus making these things take place. Then there's all this communication going on before text messages too. It's crazy, right? Then they started attempting to utilize, because there were certain individuals that did not think it was taking place in the intestines for these epileptic patients. They thought there was some sort of metabolic thing taking place from it, or a neurological kind of thing. So long story kind of short, they were able to use, some doctors took this idea of the ketogenic diet, applied it to epileptic patients, and lo and behold, it seemed to work, right? And there was individuals out there who were really chasing the answer, why is this working? And it's funny, they stumbled upon the reason before even realizing it was the reason and just disregarded it. So when measuring people's urine, they noticed high levels of blood ketones in the urine, but they were like, oh, this is just a metabolic byproduct of, the breakdown of fatty acids, so it's not anything that we need to know about. So at that point, they were still looking for the mechanism that was taking place. And granted, there's tons of mechanisms happening in the brain of why blood ketones are benefiting this. And so it became then the go-to treatment for individuals with epilepsy, and it was the traditional ketogenic diet, which is much different than what we utilize today for the modified ketogenic diet. And we'll talk about the differences here in a little bit, but essentially the traditional ketogenic diet is a 90% fat diet, which is very hard to maintain. It's doable, but it's 90% fat, essentially 6% protein and 4% carbohydrate. So it's a 4:1 ratio, which is insane. But it's really limiting the protein just to make sure that you don't have any of those insulin spikes or anything like that to be able to trigger these seizures, or if that was the case, right? So after a while, in the mid-30s, this was going on for 10, 15 years as the main treatment for epilepsy. Then the EEG was essentially developed, and we were able to look at what was happening with these sedatives on individuals like potassium bromide, and if it was the sedative effect in the brain that was actually influencing these seizures not to happen. And these doctors narrowed down that these sedatives, the reason for them, they did stuff to cats. That was kind of weird, honestly. There's a lot of cat research out there back in the day, apparently, and it's a little brutal because they're inducing seizures on these cats. But they were able to do it with these EEGs to be able to narrow down that the sedative effect or the sedative constituent of these medications was not the reason that they were working on seizures. So what they did then is they went around or called around to a lot of different pharmaceutical companies and identified medications that were similar in a pharmacological structure that did not have a sedative effect to be able to give these to epileptic patients, right? And lo and behold, they found one that had no sedative effect on individuals, but completely got rid of the seizures, like 85, 90% of individuals. At that point, taking a pill is much easier than following a 90% fat diet. People could, then live again, eat with their families and all that kind of stuff. And that became the main treatment for epilepsy and those kinds of things. And at that point, then only a small amount of individuals were actually having to utilize the ketogenic diet for epilepsy. And it kind of lost its way in the time of things. And, no one was really utilizing, because they didn't understand what was really going on in the ketogenic diet. And it didn't really resurface again, honestly, until like the early 90s. So that is your history of the ketogenic diet. And I just thought it was really interesting. If anyone is interested in that article, it's a 3-part thing, and we can always post it. It was pretty interesting, honestly. So that's your history of the ketogenic diet, where it came from. Bernard McFadden, the original meathead. Yeah. Okay, so these are our basic terms. I didn't know how to make this slide any fun, so I just put red lines on it. I was like, there's not a lot going on here, so let's just make this a little bit happier, right? So first off, we've already talked about what glucose is. So glucose essentially is the final result of ingesting carbohydrates. It's blood sugar, and it's what's utilized to be able to create all types of energy. And we'll talk about what ATP here is in a little bit. So we are able to utilize glucose to rephosphorylate ATP. Glycolysis, and we're specifically talking about slow glycolysis in here. There's essentially fast and slow glycolysis. This is a system that we are going to break down or lyse glucose, that's why it's called glycolysis, to be able to turn it into a certain molecule called pyruvate, where it can then be able to be turned into all kinds of other things to help create ATP. So glycolysis is essentially the pathway to create energy from glucose. Glycogenesis is, so we know that glycogen is the stored form of glucose. Glycogenesis is taking, taking your glucose and generating it into glycogen. So glycogenesis is you're generating glycogen from glucose and you're storing it. Glycogenolysis is essentially when I take my stored form of glycogen, I lyse it and I turn it back into glucose. So if I had liver glycogen stored and I needed to send it somewhere in the blood, like the brain needed energy, I would break it back down to glucose because then it can transport in the blood, and that goes through glycogenolysis. It's now glucose again and then goes where it needs to go. Now, gluconeogenesis, this is the one we're going to talk about a lot in this lecture or webinar, what you will, right? Gluconeogenesis is the body's ability to take a non-carbohydrate source and turn it into glucose. So gluco meaning glucose, neo meaning new, and genesis meaning creation, right? So essentially I can take amino acids and I can take them through the glucogenic or the gluconeogenesis pathway and turn them into glucose. So it's being able to take a non-carbohydrate source and turn it into glucose. And that's very important for some of the things that we're going to talk about. Insulin is a hormone. We kind of talked about this already, and we're just going to talk about it in the very basic terms of insulin. Insulin does a lot of things, but we're going to talk about it for its shuttling capacity. Essentially, the main important thing for insulin in this lecture is that insulin is what shuttles glucose to the target tissues to be able to be uptaken into those tissues to be utilized for glycolysis or glycogenesis. Okay. Amino acids, talked about those, breakdown of protein, the protein constituents that make up proteins as amino acids. Talked about triglycerides, those are stored forms of fatty acids and glycerol. When we're talking about aerobic and aerobic respiration, when we're talking about aerobic exercise and anaerobic exercise, aerobic means in the presence of oxygen. So you're working at a capacity that has a low enough intensity where oxygen can be utilized to help create energy, and anaerobic is there is no, we're working at an intensity where oxygen is not being able to be utilized. So aerobic respiration is the creation of energy through respiration, breathing, and all these kinds of things, right? So, it's the buildup of ATP or energy through aerobic channels. So we're able to utilize oxygen in this creation of energy for the body. That is what aerobic respiration is. Phosphorylation, right, is the funnest thing to say. This essentially, we're going to talk about ATP. ATP is our body's energy system, or it's our body's energy molecule. It's like its currency, what it can do things. When we use ATP to create energy, it breaks apart into ADP and a phosphorus and a P, right, a phosphate. Okay, so when we rephosphorylate something, or phosphorylation is adding a phosphate back onto that to make ADP back into ATP. And that's essentially what's happening in these energy pathways. We're taking now this broken down form of ATP, which is our energy molecule that creates energy for us. After we use it, it breaks down into another molecule called ADP, which is adenosine diphosphate from adenosine triphosphate. And then we want to add a phosphate group back onto that to make it back to ATP. And that's what this phosphorylation is. And you have substrate phosphorylation, you have oxidative phosphorylation, and we're going to talk about oxidative essentially in this lecture. Ketogenesis is developing ketones, right? Genesis, again, creating. So ketogenesis is the development and creation of ketones. Ketosis is the process that's taking place kind of in the body. It's the state of being after what happens through ketogenesis. Ketones are these other energy substrate that is created from ketogenesis, or the ketotic state, okay? And then adenosine triphosphate. This one is important, so it gets its own little slide, right? And I kind of jumped to it earlier. So adenosine triphosphate, and this is a great quote, and because we're just going to talk about it in its most basic terms, is it's the molecule that the body's, it's the currency for everything. If you need to build up something, if you need to break down something, if you need to create, me talking needs ATP, me sitting here needs ATP, right? Everything that we need to do within our body to be able to survive needs ATP. It is the currency that the body utilizes to create energy, right? When we're doing muscle actions, when we're lifting things up, we're utilizing ATP. When our body is eating stuff, and even when we go through glycolysis and we break down that glucose, we need ATP to break it down. It's weird to think that in this process where we're generating ATP, we actually need ATP to go through this process, right? And then you develop a net ATP essentially, right? So it stands for adenosine triphosphate, which is an adenosine, right? We don't need to get into the basic chemical structure of it. And it has 3 phosphate groups into it. And these phosphate groups are high energy yielding groups, right? Especially the first one. So when you break apart an ATP and you turn it into ADP, which you see on the right side, you give out energy. And then our goal is to be able to rephosphorylate this ATP, turn it back from ADP into ATP so we can use it again. So your body is the ultimate recycling system, right? So this is happening millions and millions of times as we speak. It's happening right now, right? And the body, some people's body is more efficient with it and some body is less efficient with it. The thing is your body can never complete its stores of ATP. You would die if you completely depleted them. That's why we have all these different energy systems within our body to be able to do this. So when we have, like when you talk about the phosphagen creatine system, right? That's when we're not going to be talking about these things, but that's when we're doing real, like a 100-meter sprint, right? I'm going max velocity. I'm doing as hard as I can. There's a system in there to be able to rephosphorylate the ATP that's being broken down, right? So when we talk about glycolysis, when we talk about beta oxidation, when we talk about ketosis and ketogenesis, all these things are trying to do is to be able to create ATP from the broken down forms of ADP, or ATP, which is ADP, and then you can get AMP, which is adenosine monophosphate. We only have one phosphate group to it, right? So we break it down and we build it back up, and we're going to continue using it. We are sustainable, right? We are the ultimate recycler. So ATP, extremely important molecule within the body, and we're just going to kind of leave it at that. All right, now we're going to get kind of into the weeds of things. And I purposely found the most simple picture I could find of glycolysis and beta oxidation here, okay? Because there is hundreds of things taking place within these two processes, okay? But I just want to talk about simple what's kind of going on, right? So during aerobic respiration, so right now we are all in aerobic respiration, right? When we're doing low grades of activity that require, like that we can allow an oxygen to get into our body, we're utilizing oxygen, we're using aerobic respiration to create ATP. Typically during our typical conditions, and I say typical, which this might not even been typical for our hunter-gatherer individuals because they might not have had as much well, they definitely did not have as much source of carbohydrate as we did, right? But in typical conditions today, what we see is the dominant amount of ATP production comes from slow glycolysis and from beta oxidation. And this is when we have our typical Western diet coming in from 45-65% carbohydrates and those kinds of things, right? I'm not going to go down the rabbit hole of the difference between fast and slow glycolysis. Just understand that slow glycolysis is what we're going to just think about. Just think about glycolysis as glycolysis. So these two energy systems, glycolysis and beta oxidation, which glycolysis is utilizing glucose and beta oxidation is utilizing fatty acids, are our two main systems that are going to create energy, i.e. ATP, for us to be able to complete tasks, whatever it is, talking, standing, cellular turnover, cellular death, me just walking to that door, whatever it is, these things are what is providing the energy for us. So we're going to walk through these things very basically, and we're going to explain on a very basic surface level what's happening. And we're going to talk about the reason we have oxalo acetate up there is because it's important to ketogenesis. Okay, so we're going to talk about these two normal energy systems first, and then how when we deprive ourselves from one of them, how ketogenesis or ketosis comes into play. Okay, so can they see my little thing here, or do I have to be over here? They can? Okay. So, okay. So here we have glycolysis, okay? And this again is our pathway of turning glucose into energy, all right? So we have glucose here, we have glycolysis here, okay? There's tons of things going on in glycolysis, and if you are a bioenergetics nerd out there, I understand that in glycolysis, one molecule of glucose is being lysed in half into two different 3-carbon molecules, so everything's happening twice, right? We don't need to go through all that in-depth stuff, right? We just need to think about turning glucose essentially into ATP at the end of the day, okay? So when we go through slow glycolysis, right, the end result of glucose is going to be pyruvate, okay? In fast glycolysis, lo and behold, it's actually lactate, but we don't need to go there, okay? So our end result is pyruvate, okay? Throughout glycolysis, we actually had a little bit of production of ATP anaerobically, which is called substrate phosphorylation, but it was only 2 ATP were developed, right? And I make my students learn about how much ATP is developed and stuff like that for one turns, but we don't need to do that here, all right? So just think about it. We have glucose, goes through glycolysis, turns into pyruvate. Pyruvate then is going to be turned into acetyl-CoA, okay? Acetyl-CoA then goes into this thing called the citric acid cycle, also called the Krebs cycle, also called the TCA cycle. They're all interchangeable names. I like the citric acid cycle because essentially what happens is pyruvate turns into acetyl-CoA, and then acetyl-CoA is processed by this thing called oxaloacetate, which is actually in turn also created from pyruvate. And these two things, when processed together, turn into citric acid. And then it goes through this big turn of all kinds of different intermediates kind of reacting with it. And it develops, well, one, it develops another 2 ATP, right? But it actually develops, more importantly, all these different electron carriers, which go to this place called the electron transport chain, which is where the dominant amount of ATP is developed. So as this acetyl-CoA reacts or is processed by this oxaloacetate, it has like all these different stops along the way, which essentially develop these things that are shifted off this citric acid cycle and sent somewhere else to be able to create ATP, okay? So the same thing happens with our fatty acids, right? So our fatty acids are broken down through a process called lipolysis. So you have glycolysis and you have lipolysis, right? And they're broken down into fatty acids and they're glycerol. Well, again, we're just talking about the fatty acids. They go through this process called beta oxidation. Beta oxidation itself actually sends off these electron carriers to be able to go to this electron transport chain to be able to produce energy. But then they are also turned into acetyl-CoA. And then when the acetyl-CoA goes into the citric acid cycle, again, it reacts with oxaloacetate and it goes through this big cycle creating ATP. So both these things are taking place when we're going through aerobic respiration, right? And we're still getting some mechanisms from our phosphagen cycle and stuff like that. But for the most part, our dominant ATP development is coming from here. Now, before we move on, I need to talk about oxaloacetate and what's happening here, because oxaloacetate is a very important molecule when it comes to ketosis or ketogenesis. So pyruvate also creates oxaloacetate and actually creates it through gluconeogenesis. But oxaloacetate is needed in the citric acid cycle to be able to process acetyl-CoA to be able to turn into citric acid, where it's going to go through this entire process to create all this ATP. So when we have enough glucose coming in the body, we have an ample amount of pyruvate to be able to be left over for the citric acid cycle for acetyl-CoA, both resulting from pyruvate from glucose and acetyl-CoA resulting from beta oxidation from lipolysis and fatty acids, to be able to create this harmonious amount of all this ATP, okay? So that's, in a nutshell, what is happening during aerobic respiration and our basic utilization of bioenergetics in the body. So now, when going to the ketogenic state, oh, that's right, gotta go left here, we are going to see a little bit of a difference. And we say this is typical conditions, right? And this is typical conditions because we are so available to have carbohydrates for us now that we're consistently being able to feed the system that's the preferred system. It's very efficient, right? I don't know necessarily that our hunter-gatherers actually utilize this system, and it could be considered typical for the dominant amount of our evolution, because we were typically in a fasted state looking for the next meal, right? So we're consistently breaking down our fatty acids without the presence of glucose. So who knows if this really is the typical condition for the human body. So that brings us to this fun picture. And honestly, while this may look like a lot, trust me, when you look at all these things together of what they really look like, this is kind of nothing, okay? But there's a lot going on here. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to break down essentially what we're talking about here. So now we're talking about ketogenesis, okay? So the development of ketones. And this is going to happen by either being in a fasted state or by depriving the body of carbohydrates coming in. So now we're no longer, glycolysis is still happening, right? There's still a little bit, but we are greatly depriving the amount of carbohydrates coming in to be able to go through glycolysis, okay? So this is we see this happen in very low carbohydrate diets, i.e. the ketogenic diet, or we see this during fasted states or starvation, okay? So we have a very minimal amount of glucose coming in, okay? Now, what is going to happen from this minimal amount of glucose coming in? We remember that when we eat carbohydrates, they turn into glucose in the body. Insulin is then released, right? So the glucose in the body is a signal for the body to release insulin to take this glucose molecule where it needs to go. When we don't have glucose coming into the body, there is no insulin production in the body, right? There still is, but there's not the same amount of insulin production, right? And when there is this low amount of insulin production in the body tells itself to break down triglycerides into fatty acids at a greater standpoint than it typically would, because it needs to get energy from somewhere else and glucose is not coming in. Additionally, and I forgot to put some of the basic terms section, there's another thing in the body called glucagon. And when we don't have glucose coming in, we have elevated levels of glucagon. And that is also a signaler to the body to begin breaking down more fatty acids through beta oxidation, okay? So now we don't have the glucose coming in, so we don't have as much glycolysis taking place, which means we don't have as much pyruvate being developed. Granted, pyruvate can be developed from other sources in the body, but the dominant source is coming from glycolysis, okay? So what's happening is we're having less pyruvate being developed, okay? And we have more acetyl-CoA actually being developed from this breakdown of fatty acids. So what we talked about is that the body is smart, and there is systems or things in the body that require glucose no matter what, right? So while the brain can feed off ketones, and it can be utilized dominantly through ketone usage, there is a bare minimum that the brain has to get from glucose. Also, your red blood cells and your kidney needs to have a certain amount of glucose, right? And it's a small amount. So our body is smart, and it's going to go through the whole gluconeogenesis pathway to be able to develop that glucose. However, the gluconeogenesis pathway needs the little amount of pyruvate to be able to go. I believe gluconeogenesis is an 11 enzyme sequence, right? And going through these sequences, it needs pyruvate to be able to start in this gluconeogenic pathway. And it also needs oxaloacetate, right? And remember, we said that this is important. An important molecule is. So oxaloacetate is needed to be able to take these non-carbohydrate sources and turn them into glucose. So now what's happening is this oxaloacetate that we have a little amount of, because it is oxaloacetate is developed from pyruvate, is being diverted from the citric acid cycle or the Krebs cycle to be able to allow glucose to be developed through gluconeogenesis. Now remember that we need oxaloacetate within the citric acid cycle to process acetyl-CoA. So we still have a little bit of an oxaloacetate being in the citric acid cycle to be able to process that acetyl-CoA, but by no means enough to support the max amount that's being now developed through this excess amount of beta oxidation taking place, because the body again is signaling the body to break down more fatty acids to be able to develop and support the energy functions that are needed for the body. So essentially you get a backup right here. That's why these lines are right here for this acetyl-CoA. However, the body has a system to be able to deal with this extra acetyl-CoA. So ketogenesis happens in the liver. So essentially, in simply thinking, this acetyl-CoA is diverted to the liver, okay? Or it's already happening in the liver, okay? And this is happening in the mitochondria of the liver, okay? So what happens is acetyl-CoA goes into the mitochondria, and it goes through a whole other bioenergetic pathway, right? It combines with another acetyl-CoA, it turns into this, and it turns into that, goes through a bunch of other enzymes we don't need to talk about. But the end result is it develops these ketones, and it develops acetoacetate, beta-hydroxybutyrate, and acetone, right? We're just going to call them ketones, okay? That's all we really need to know. Beta-hydroxybutyrate really is the big one that we're looking at, right? So the liver then develops these ketones from this excess amount of acetyl-CoA that is being utilized in the liver. Now, the liver doesn't actually utilize ketones as an energy source, so lo and behold, it dumps it into the blood. And now these ketones can be sent to the brain for function, can be sent to the muscles for function, can be sent to all those other areas that typically call on glucose for their function and for their development of their ATP and those kinds of things to be able to have energy production. So at this point, beta oxidation and ketogenesis are the dominant supplier of ATP. Now remember that the body does need a small amount of glucose to be able to maintain certain functions, and that's where we're getting from gluconeogenesis. Additionally, and this is what's lost on a lot of people, is the muscles throughout the body can usually store about 350 grams of glycogen, right? And we're actually able to top off the body's stores of glycogen through gluconeogenesis of amino acids without, something really damaging our amino acid profile. So when it comes to our workouts and those kinds of things, our muscles are still pretty topped off to the amount of glycogen that they need that was developed through gluconeogenesis, which kind of that helps us with this whole myth debunk that you aren't able to function as well performance-wise when on a ketogenic diet, which we'll talk here in a little bit. Okay. So we went through a basic bioenergetics of the body and of ketogenesis, right? And I just want you to see that so you understand what's going on during ketosis, right? It's important my goal is always to take a complex subject and be able to make it simple, right? And I understand that maybe it's not the most simple thing in the world, but hopefully you have an idea of what's going on. Okay. Now I want to talk about how do you get into a ketogenic state, okay? And there's multiple ways to be able to do this, right? And we talked about the traditional ketogenic diet already. I do not recommend that. That would literally only be used for therapeutic reasons, right? Only individuals that are going through some sort of, one, it's going to be monitored by a doctor or medical supervisor, and they're trying to treat epilepsy. They're trying to treat some sort of a neurological disease or those kinds of things. They're going to be utilizing the traditional ketogenic diet. For most of us, we're going to utilize a modified ketogenic diet. And then I have this one over here that I call it an active ketogenic diet. And this is to where we want to make sure that we have muscle gain taking place. It's good for our athletes, and it's for those individuals who are consistently active. Okay. And understand that these percentages are all, they could be, it's 75 to 80. They're all kind of interchangeable. They're all like a ratio, not a ratio, but a range, right? A range. But when we typically think about the modified ketogenic diet, we think that remember, so TDEE stands for your total daily energy expenditure. This is the amount of calories that your body burns each day. Okay, with your basal metabolic rate, which is just all resting functions and cellular turnover and all that kind of stuff, brain function, that stuff, right? And that's the dominant amount of calories that your body burns. And then your activity level, me walking over here, well, not walking, I guess, but me walking from A to B, working out, that would be my activity level, and that would add on to my basal metabolic rate, creating my total daily energy expenditure. And we have a slide in here. I'll teach you guys how to calculate that. I think honestly a whole other webinar would be to teach how to do these manipulations of total daily energy expenditure, identify how many calories that we need to be in a deficit to lose how much weight in X amount of time. I could have done it with this one, but I'm already going to go long enough, right? All right. So when looking at the modified ketogenic diet, what we'll do is we'll typically take our total daily energy expenditure, not gain nor lose weight, right? And we would manipulate our percentages, right? So now the typical American or the typical recommended diet is 45 to 65% carbohydrates. So we're just going to flip that on its head, right? So we see that fats for a ketogenic diet is going to be 75% of your total daily intake. Protein is at around 20% of your total daily intake, and carbohydrates is about 5% of your total daily intake, okay? And we see for this active one, we have a ratio. We're going to increase the protein, right? Save that muscle, right? And if you go to my protein lecture, you'll see that you actually have the ability to have a 10 to 35% coming from protein, those kind of things. And you can actually utilize those numbers in a ketogenic diet, right? And we could talk about that later if people are interested. But at this standpoint, we're going to take that, fats down to 65 to 70%, depending on if we're doing 25 to 30%. The most important thing is to keep that carbohydrates at 5%. People will say it's most important to keep your your carbohydrate level at 20 grams or less for modified ketosis to work. Okay, so these are distributions when thinking about percentages. Okay. Now, to kind of go through and talk about how this would work, and we're going to kind of rush through this. So if you want to go back and do this for yourself, just pause this slide once you get all this stuff kind of highlighted up. So there are certain calculations that you can utilize to calculate your total daily energy expenditure. There's multiple out there. I'm using this one called the Harrison-Benedict because it does not take into consideration your body fat percentage. So anyone can do it. I would recommend get your body fat percentage taken and then utilize those calculators, or use your Apple Watch. There's a cool thing out there called the Whoop strap that actually calculates these things really, really well. But what we want to do is we want to calculate our basal metabolic rate first. And again, our basal metabolic rate is our body's expenditure that for all its basic daily functions minus activity, right? And we see that our the calculation for males and females are different, right? So our males is 66.5 plus 13.8 times by weight, and it's got to be in kilograms, plus 5 times by height, and it's got to be in centimeters, minus 6.8 times by age, and that's age and what you really are. Don't try to cheat nobody, right? Obviously follow your PEMDAS, please excuse my dear Aunt Sally, right? Do your parentheses and all that kind of stuff first. I gave notes in here to make sure that you know this is in kilograms and in heights and centimeters. So to figure out your weight in kilograms, remember if you're 175 pounds, divide by 2.2, that's going to give you kilograms. For your height, you would figure out how many inches. So I'm 5'7", so I'd go 5 times by 12 plus, which is whatever, and then plus 7, and then I would times that number by 2.54. So there's 2.54 centimeters in every inch. So that's how you figure those numbers out. And then you need to look at these activity multipliers. So to be able to get your total daily energy expenditure, you need to multiply your BMR times by this activity multiplier. And this activity multiplier depends on what your current levels of activity are. You'll see there's moderate, very active, extremely active, and all this kind of stuff. So you see moderate is someone who's exercising 3 to 5 times a week. So their BMR would be whatever that calories is times by 1.55 would equal their total daily energy expenditure. And I laid these all out here for you all so you can see them. I typically, even though I work out quite often, I consider myself in the moderate range. So now I gave you a little scenario, and we're doing Bill's scenario. Okay, so Bill wants to become a ketogenic, get in a ketogenic state. So first we see that Bill is 175 pounds, also known as 79.5 kilograms. Bill is 5'9", which is 175.26 centimeters, and he is 31 years old. His activities, he works out about 4 times per week. So this is all the information we need to know to be able to calculate his basal metabolic rate. At this point, we plug in his basal metabolic rate, and we identify that his BMR is 1,829.82 calories. Now, to be able to figure out what his total daily energy expenditure is, we need to take that number and multiply it by the correct activity multiplier, which if he's working out 4 times a week would be around 1.55, resulting in a total daily energy expenditure of 2,836.22 calories. Now we need to figure out the percentages of this individual's total daily intake to be able to identify each macronutrient to create a ketogenic state. But first, we also need to understand that protein, carbohydrates, and fat have different calories per gram because these numbers are going to work into your calculations. So understand that for protein and carbohydrates, you have 4 calories per gram, and for fat, you have 9 calories per gram. Because to be able to figure out from these percentages, from the total calories, you need to be able to divide by the calories per gram to identify how many grams you need to be eating of each macronutrient. So we see if we want him to work at a 75%, so the modified kind of area, we see that the total intake coming from fats will be 2,127 calories, which is around 236 grams of fat. For protein, we said he's going to be at 20%, which is about 567 calories, also known as 141.81 calories. So remember, I'm just taking 2,127, dividing it by 9, and that's how I'm getting the grams. For protein, I'm taking 567.24, dividing it by 4, and that's how I'm getting the grams, okay? And then carbohydrates, 5%, we're seeing that a total of 35.5 grams. Now, this kind of goes against that 20-gram total, right? So this would definitely put somebody into a ketogenic state, okay? It would definitely help, and it is interdependent. We'll talk about those things here in a little bit. Now, there's also the ability to be able to do this by a body weight per kilogram of macro, right? So we already talked about that the total amount of carbohydrates, they'll say 30 grams, but preferably 20 grams, right? And then different institutions have different ranges for how many grams per kilogram of body weight of protein. We go over those in depth in the Protein 101 lecture. So if you want to learn more about those, you could literally apply those ratios to this while maintaining the percentage of fat, or I mean the amount of fat and the grams of carbohydrate. So if you are a strength and power athlete, you could utilize the strength and power athlete ratios that we discussed in the Protein 101 lecture, keep the 30 grams or 20 grams the same, and then work out what you want for fat. So you can utilize those as well. The one thing that drives me crazy about these ratios is they look at grams per kilogram of total body weight. I believe when you identify your protein needs, you need to base it off your lean body mass because that is what is calling for the amount of protein needed. And we'll talk about a keto calculator that I'm going to offer you guys here in a little bit that actually provides that. Okay, and then fat essentially would make up the rest. Now what you see is we'll take Bill again. He's 175 pounds. That's 79.5 kilograms, right? So step one, we already got his total daily energy expenditure. We know that he's going to have 120 calories coming from 30 grams of fat, so we're going to give him the 30 grams. Then we're going to go in the mid-range, right? And we're going to identify, oh, this is about 120 grams of protein that he's going to be taking in. So then what we're going to do is we take 477, which is the amount of calories from the protein, and then 120 calories, which is the amount of calories from the carbohydrates, subtract it from the total daily energy expenditure to identify the calories that he needs for fat, and then divide that by 9, and that's going to be the amount of grams for fat that this individual would need. Again, what's going to happen, especially if you're more of a lean individual, once you start using kilogram or gram per kilogram or pound of lean body mass, it's nice because the protein amount is going to increase, right? But you don't want to increase your protein amount too much because it can have an insulin effect or a higher, no matter what amino acids are going to have a small insulin effect, but usually it's not enough to kick you out of the ketogenic state. But too much, especially at one time, can definitely have a larger effect on the insulin state, taking you out of ketosis. So this is the way that you could do it. And there's multiple ways to do this, right? There's tons of information online of exactly how to do this. So I provide these resources, right? And these are different resources that you can utilize to calculate these things. If I click on one of these, will it open up on the screen?
I don't know.
We're going to try something real quick. Hopefully. No?
No, because it's showing this one.
Do I need to, would that work?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. So what we see, this is, okay, how I calculate my ketogenic total. So this is an easy way just to do it on your own without having, you have to do all these calculations. So let's just do me, right? So I'm 32 years old. Oh, this is a total daily energy calculator. Let's just do the keto one. This one will calculate your total daily energy expenditure. But there is ones that we have that will actually do your entire ketogenic, manipulation. Okay, so this is going to show what my intake needs to be for a ketogenic diet. So I'm a male. I am 175 pounds. Okay, I am short. My date of birth, let's go, where is it at? 1987, June 20th. Okay, you all know my, oh no. 1987, June 20th, right? It's in there. Cool. So it calculates my basal metabolic rate. I'm going to go, I'm moderately active, gives me another identification of my total daily energy expenditure. This one's using a lower one, right, than typical, than what I was using, right? So it's giving you a different reading, okay, which is fine. They're not, you utilize all these to be able to identify these. Then I'm going to say I am 7% body fat. Okay, and this one I like because it calculates your lean body mass, and it's going to base your protein levels off your lean body mass. Then it talks about how much carbs can I eat. It gives you like a scale of what you're going to be doing. Let's say I want to do 30 grams of carbs because I want to enjoy a banana each day, right? How much protein should I do? Okay, so a very active person, okay, choose protein, okay, 1 gram per kilogram. Let's just do that, okay? Roining protein is too low. So let's see this. So based on very active 162. All right, well, let's just do 168. Protein too high. Oh, that's awesome. It's too damn high. So this is asking me to do this. This is weird. Is it? I thought this would ask me to put in. So let's just do this. All right, we're doing 150 grams chosen. I thought it would ask me to put in how much I want per kilogram of body weight. That's what it was asking me to do earlier, which was nice. How much fat should I eat? Okay, so do I want to be in a deficit? So here you can choose your caloric intake, try to moderate deficit. So eat fat to your liking. You have chosen 30 grams, 150 grams of protein. This means you have already 720 calories of your daily requirement recovered, right? What's left is for you to choose how much to eat. So I don't want to be in a deficit, so let's just say 0% deficit. So I will maintain my current body weight, okay? And then it spits out these numbers, right? And this seems a little bit more bearable. So this one's doing a 70% intake coming from fat, and then 25% coming from protein, and 30% coming from carbs. So there's tons of ways to do this, and I just wanted to show you this, because there is these different calculators online that will spit out this information for you. What you need to do at this point is you would need to learn how to go onto something like MyFitnessPal and be able to create your own meal plans to be able to adhere to those gram totals for your carbohydrates, fats, and those kinds of things, right? So you would need to go on there and type in I'm eating this, this, and this, and get to those proper ratios. So this is to kind of let you know that everybody is individual when it comes to how they handle things. I can handle carbohydrates better than Andrea could. She might handle fat better than I can. So N=1, right? Everybody is going to respond to these protocols, these processes different than the individual. So women have a huge variation, honestly, and it's due to hormonal fluctuation that you all have to go through. But certain things will kick me out of keto. Certain individuals are going to be able to have a higher level of protein without kicking them out of the ketogenic state and those kinds of things, right? So I say monitor yourself. And there's these things called blood ketone kits, right? This here is the Keto Mojo. This is the one that I have. Cost me $49, and I can literally measure my blood, and it measures my blood ketone levels. And then you feel like your own little doctor. And it's simple, but you do have to prick yourself, and you have to have a little blood come out. And that brings us to the point of when we are monitoring our blood ketones, what are essentially the levels that we're looking at, right? So essentially to be in nutritional ketosis, which is where I would like to be, is essentially anywhere from 0.5 to 3 millimole per liter of blood, right? I prefer myself to be anywhere from 1 to 2 if I'm not doing a ketogenic diet right now. I haven't done it for a long time. If I was doing ketosis, I would want to maintain 1 to 2 and no more higher than 3 millimoles per liter, okay? However, even starting as low as 0.5 millimole per liter, you're actually starting nutritional ketosis. Most people will recommend trying to stay within 1 to 2.5 all the way up to 3. So with that, know that we call mild ketosis 0.5 to 1, moderate 1 to 1.5, and deep ketosis 1.5 to 3. So levels above 3 do not represent any further benefit, and they actually indicate that you're not utilizing your ketones at the most optimal extent. That's why they're maintaining in your blood and staying there. So while 1.5 to 3.0 millimole per liter is considered optimal, achieving a ketone level isn't necessary for weight loss. There's been even research showing that people have drastically had weight loss take place at 0.5 millimoles. So when you are, and if you ever want to use a blood ketone kit, they will give you all this information so you know how to utilize this kind of stuff. There's also, you can use urine strips and stuff like that. I think the blood ketone, they're cheaper, right? But the blood ketone kit is much more accurate. So here's a lot of benefits that we were talking about. We are at 7 p.m. So I'm kind of rushing through these sections right now. But some of the benefits that we see from ketosis is it actually acts as an appetite suppression, right? So having this fat coming in and not having to rely on carbohydrate, which has these huge blood spikes and our body gets rid of it real fast and wants more, it actually suppresses our appetite and actually suppresses our hunger hormone ghrelin. So we actually tend to eat not as much, and we actually lose weight that way, because even though we're eating this high fat diet, we're typically not eating as many calories as our typical total daily energy expenditure would be. So we're consistently in a deficit, which would actually aid us in losing weight. So it suppresses our appetite. It also is going to help them with weight loss via appetite suppression, also via water loss. Understand that carbohydrates hold 3 grams per 1 gram of carbohydrates. So 3 grams of water to 1 gram of carbohydrates. So as you rid yourself of those, water loss takes place. So that is true. That's why a lot of people at the very beginning of a ketogenic diet have a huge weight loss. So it's not always just fat. But then you are also targeting your triglycerides and your fatty tissues to increase fat burning. So you're utilizing fat at a better aspect to be able to be utilized as energy, which helps in that weight loss. We actually reduce blood triglycerides, right? Blood fat. You would think that eating more fat in your body is going to increase your blood lipid levels, your blood triglycerides. It doesn't. We are actually become better at metabolizing them. And when our body is actually eating carbohydrate, it conserves our fat, i.e. stores them, and raises our blood lipids. So we actually see a decrease in our blood triglycerides from a ketogenic diet. It reduces and maintains blood glucose. It actually increases capillary density into tissues. So without increasing blood flow, by increasing the density of capillaries into tissues, that means you increase nutrient supply into those tissues without increasing blood flow. Aids in type 2 diabetes, right? Type 2 diabetes, essentially you're insulin insensitive, but you still have insulin in the body. So by removing the carbohydrates from the body, your insulin becomes up, or the insulin pumps become upregulated. We see in the brain that we have upregulation of GLUT1, which is the glucose/ketone transporter into the brain. And we see all these other benefits, right? A really interesting one I wanted to talk about was the anti-cancer effects on certain types of cancer. Note that the ketogenic diet is not meant to replace typical therapy and those kinds of things, but essentially certain cancer cells feed off of off of glucose because they have defective mitochondria and you cannot go through oxidative phosphorylation. And due to the fact that ketones take place specifically in the mitochondria, if you're only feeding yourself ketones, those cancer cells cannot survive. And they're seeing a lot of good research come out from that. Again, not replacing all cancer therapy though, and only for specific cancers. This is just a nice little article I saw that demonstrated a bunch of benefits for different neurological diseases and those kinds of things to benefit from ketogenic diet. Just thought I'd throw that up there to show you that I'm not spitting stuff off the top of my head. I actually am getting these things from published research articles, lots of them actually, and there's a lot of research out there if you want to look into it. I would highly recommend if you're interested in a individual who is deep into research. His name is Dom DeAgostino. His website is called Keto Nutrition, and he is a legitimate scientist that does all kinds of stuff on hyperbaric levels and dealing with neurological issues with ketones and those kinds of things. So some misconceptions. Understand that ketosis is not the same as ketoacidosis, okay? So ketoacidosis typically takes place in type 1 diabetics who have runaway ketones and blood glucose levels. So if you're not taking your insulin levels in, remember type 1 diabetics are no longer producing insulin. Insulin is what shuttles your glucose into the target tissues that need it. If you have glucose rising and you're not taking your insulin, your body is not producing insulin, those blood glucose levels rise. Your insulin levels are already low. Your body tells you, oh, there's no insulin levels. Glucagon raises. We tell the body to break down a bunch of fatty acids to turn into ketone. This turns into a vicious cycle, developing a high rate of ketones, a high rate of glucose that puts you in a ketoacidotic state, which is literally fatal. But ketosis and ketoacidosis are two very different things. In a typical ketogenic diet will not, you have to be 10 millimole per liter, right? A ketogenic diet will not put you into ketoacidosis. Ketosis does not increase your metabolism. A lot of people are like, oh, I'm going to increase my total daily energy expenditure by going into ketosis. If you eat the same amount of calories on a ketogenic diet as your total daily energy expenditure, you're not going to lose weight. You may burn a little bit more fat and all those kinds of things, but your weight will maintain the same. Body composition, all that stuff comes from calories in versus calories out. It's not increasing your metabolism. Your performance doesn't typically drop off from ketosis, right? If you are keto adapted and you're able to utilize ketones at a high capability, you've been on the diet for a long time, your body will utilize those ketones just as efficiently as they would glucose. People that have utilized research with exogenous ketones to be able to see if they would have a performance effect gave these to athletes who were not keto adapted and never utilized them before. So of course, if you give the body something that's not used to, it's not going to perform at the same state. So it's not true that you don't have an energy in for intense workouts. I already talked about how you also have enough gluconeogenesis to be able to top off the muscle supply of glucose or glycogen to be able to supply for those different workouts and those kinds of things. Muscles do not deteriorate on a ketogenic diet unless you don't have enough protein coming in. And the keto flu does not last forever. Understand when you first get put on ketogenic diet, when you're shifting from utilizing glucose to ketones, you're not going to feel great, right? It's going to be headaches. There's going to be some things you don't feel super good. It's going to take a week or two to really adapt to it, right? And to adjust to it. And it takes anywhere from 8 months to a year to really adapt to being able to prime yourself to being able to utilize these ketones. But that keto flu will last max 2 to 3 weeks. I'm rushing through all this right now because we're towards times, which then says I want to talk about conditions that require medical supervision. Understand if you're utilizing a ketogenic diet, you're a type 1, type 2 diabetic, that's insulin or oral medications. Make sure to do this in the presence of a doctor. If you're utilizing it for high blood pressure or on those high blood pressure medications, if you have liver, heart, or kidney issues, right? If you have a history of gastric bypass, if you are pregnant, I would not recommend it. Definitely individuals who do not should avoid the ketogenic diet is pregnancy and individuals with rare metabolic conditions that are typically diagnosed in childhood, such as enzyme deficiencies that interfere with the body's ability to make the use of ketones, right? So remember, there's all those different enzymes that create these things to take place. So is there any questions?
We did have one comment. She's not on here anymore, but she wanted to know if the female calculation was a typo because it said 655.1, whereas the male said 666.5.
It is 655.1. That is correct.
Oh,
yep.
Okay.
It is 655.1. Yeah.
Okay. And the male is still
65.1 or 66 point, whatever.
66.5.
Yeah. So you'll see when you calculate that all the way out, it's correct.
Oh.
Yeah, you'll see. Yeah, because your subtraction in that, if we go. There it is. So you will have you have less of a ratio in the height, 1.9 times by height, right? We have 5.0, right? Mm-hmm. So all those things, it comes and works out. Yeah. I would actually recommend, if she comes and watches this again, to utilize what's called the Catch-McCardle method if you're going to calculate those kinds of things, because that's the one that takes body fat into play. And again, those calculators are all online. You can type in that the Harrison-Benedict method, and then it'll calculate it for you. Just type in total daily energy expenditure calculator, or utilize one of those links, and it'll take you to one of those. We good?
I don't have any questions.
All right. Well, thank you all for coming. This is my last webinar of the semester, but we have primitive shelter building happening, and then we have did the nutrition one happen?
Backpacking nutrition.
And backpacking nutrition.
Both in November.
And they are on the Wellbeing website calendar events. They're on the Global Connections calendar events. Please send us interested webinars that you want to do. I'm thinking we already had interest in the intermittent fasting one. I think I'd like to do one on how to break down your macronutrients and that kind of stuff. Anything that you guys, it doesn't have to be nutrition, right? It could be whatever you all want. Just send Andrea information and let us know. So thanks so much.